April 18, 1942. 16 B-25 bombers sat on the deck of the USS Hornet bound for Tokyo. The plan was to launch at dusk, bomb Japan, and escape to China. Then the Nidomaru, a Japanese picket boat, spotted the American task force at dawn. The surprise was gone. Commander Jimmy Doolittle gave the order. They would launch immediately, 12 hours early and 600 miles from Japan. The early launch meant every gallon of fuel was precious. China was now a long shot. One by one, the heavy bombers clawed into the gray Pacific sky. 80 airmen were heading into the unknown. Their planes carried painted nose art, names like Whirling Dervish and Ruptured Duck, small acts of defiance against the most powerful empire in the Pacific. Doolittle closed in on Japan, skimming the wave tops at 200 feet. His navigator struggled for a precise fix. They came ashore 50 miles north of Tokyo. Doolittle pulled up to 1,200 feet and dropped his incendiaries on the armory. The red light on his panel flashed 4 times as the bombs fell. He dove back to rooftop level and escaped through the smoke. First Lieutenant Travis Hoover flew on Doolittle's wing. He lost his bearings but saw the Sumida River and turned west. Lacking a specific target, he dropped his bombs on a dense industrial district. The explosions were massive, leveling 38 buildings. The shockwave nearly lifted the bomber out of the sky. First Lieutenant Robert Gray came ashore 20 minutes after the leaders. The Japanese were awake now. Anti-aircraft fire ripped through the sky over Tokyo Bay. Gray found a diesel plant and scored a direct hit as he fled. His gunner opened fire on the streets below, killing a student at Mizumoto Primary School. First Lieutenant Everett Holstrom had a leaking fuel tank and a faulty compass. The early launch had scrambled his calculations. He made landfall far south of the capital. Heading north, he flew straight into a formation of Japanese fighters. With no working heavy machine guns, he salvoed his bombs into the sea and turned south to flee. Captain Davy Jones got lost. He flew down the Boso Peninsula, bypassing Tokyo entirely. Realizing his mistake, he banked into the bay with fuel running low. He picked a new target on the waterfront. His bombs killed 27 people, the highest death toll of the mission. Dean Hallmark flew the Green Hornet. He saw no fighters and no flak. He climbed to 1,500 feet and dropped his bombs on the steel mills. Hallmark banked the plane and circled back to observe the damage. The crew strained for a final glimpse as thick black smoke and anti-aircraft fire flooded the sky. The burning factories felt like a small private victory. Ted Lawson and the Ruptured Duck roared over the beach at just 20 feet. Farmers waved, but then Lawson saw the Japanese flag. He gripped the controls tighter. The sight of the red sun felt like a physical blow. He pulled up and dropped his bombs on the factories. Anti-aircraft fire thundered around him. "Let's get out of here," he ordered. Ski York's bomber burned through fuel at a terrifying rate. Calculations showed he would not come within 300 miles of China. He angled north, choosing a desperate alternative. He flew straight for the Soviet Union. The crew crossed the Sea of Japan and landed in Vladivostok. They were promptly interned by Russian authorities. Edgar McElroy targeted the Yokosuka Naval Station. The prize was the submarine tender Taygay being converted into an aircraft carrier. McElroy's bomb tore a hole 26 feet tall and 50 feet wide in the hull of the Taygay. The dry dock erupted in flames. The damage would delay the carrier's completion by 4 months. Richard Joyce hit the Japan Special Steel Company. His bombs killed 25 people. 9 fighters dove on him. He pushed the nose down, screaming over the rooftops. Ross Greening outran 4 enemy fighters and unloaded his bombs on a naval air station. Major Jack Hilger found Nagoya almost defenseless. His incendiary struck the Army hospital, the arsenal, and the Mitsubishi Aircraft Works. Huge fires raged across the city. Donald Smith reached Kobe without seeing a single enemy fighter. He bombed the Kawasaki Dockyard Aircraft Factory. Billy Farrow, the last man off the Hornet, hit Nagoya with his incendiaries. He sparked a massive fire at a gas company tank. The bat out of hell turned west and vanished over the horizon. On the ground, the Japanese were only now scrambling into their cockpits. The raiders had come and gone. In Tokyo, the reaction was sheer disbelief. Civilians waved at the bombers. Diplomats argued it was a drill. But the smoke over the city was real. The psychological blow was delivered. Japan was no longer invulnerable. The world now knew that America could strike back. 3 minutes after the last B-25 roared off the Hornet's deck, Admiral William Halsey ordered the task force to reverse course and steam east at full speed, putting distance between his carriers and the enemy homeland. The Enterprise took the lead as lookouts scanned the horizon for any sign of Japanese retaliation. Sailors aboard the Nashville drew first blood, opening fire on Japanese picket boats that had shadowed the American fleet. The cruiser sank one patrol boat and captured 5 enemy sailors from another, hauling them aboard with ropes and cargo nets. Back on the Hornet, Seaman Robert Wall, whose arm had been mangled by a spinning propeller during launch, was taken to the sickbay. Doctors had no choice but to amputate, and the crew raised $2,700 for the injured sailor as he wept in gratitude. Over the open ocean, Doolittle's bomber droned westward as the fuel gauge sank lower and lower. Navigator Hank Potter ran the numbers and delivered the grim news. They would run dry 135 miles short of the Chinese coast. The crew braced for a long swim in shark-infested water. Then Potter caught a break. A shifting wind began pushing the bomber from behind, adding precious miles to their range. The coast of China appeared out of the haze just as the engine sputtered. Doolittle ordered his men to jump, and one by one they vanished into the dark, rainy night. He landed hard in a rice paddy, filthy and cold, before stumbling toward a farmhouse where Chinese soldiers eventually found him and offered help. Dean Hallmark's Green Hornet never made it to an airfield. Both engines died as the bomber crossed the Chinese coast, and the plane tore into the sea. The left wing snapped off on impact, and the fuselage split open like a gutted fish. Bombardier William Dieter and gunner Donald Fitzmaurice were killed, their bodies washing ashore the next morning. Hallmark, co-pilot Robert Medder, and navigator Chase Nielsen survived the crash and crawled onto the beach, exhausted and bleeding. Ted Lawson's ruptured duck also ran out of fuel as he approached land. The engines died at just a quarter mile from shore, and the bomber flipped upside down when it hit the surf. Lawson smashed his face and shattered his left knee. Navigator Charles McClure broke both arms. Corporal David Thatcher scrambled through the wreckage and dragged his wounded crewmates onto the beach, then tended their injuries by lamplight inside a fisherman's hut, using only rags and a small first aid kit. He never stopped working, even as his own head wound bled through his flight helmet. Ski-York's bomber, unable to reach China, crossed the Sea of Japan and landed on the coast of Russia near Vladivostok. A dozen Soviet soldiers surrounded the plane, grinning and shaking hands. York told them through gestures that this was a goodwill flight, but the Russian officers were not fooled. The Russians drove York and his crew to a house outside Khabarovsk and told them they were now internees of the Soviet Union. The flyers sat in stunned silence, realizing they would not be flying home anytime soon. Their bags arrived days later, picked clean of candy and American cigarettes. Donald Smith's bomber, the TNT, ran out of fuel as he approached China in heavy fog. He set the plane down on the water off Tan Dusan Island, and the crew scrambled out as the bomber slipped beneath the waves. They swam through the cold surf for 2 hours before reaching the rocky shore, exhausted and shivering. Chinese fishermen found Smith and his men and brought them to a mud-walled hut where a fire was built on the dirt floor. The villagers boiled tea and served rice with dried shrimp, warming the aviators with their hospitality. The airmen learned they had landed on the only island in the area not controlled by the Japanese. Doolittle awoke at dawn on April 19th, still filthy from the rice paddy. He hiked down a worn path toward a village and found a farmer who led him to a military garrison. The Chinese major there was suspicious at first, demanding his pistol, but when soldiers found Doolittle's parachute hidden in the farmer's house, the major smiled and extended his hand. Within hours, Doolittle's crew gathered around him at Tien Mu Shen, each man telling his own story of the night's jump. The mission commander felt the weight of command lift just slightly as he counted his men alive. From Tien Mu Shen, Doolittle and his men traveled south by boat toward Chuchao. Their vessel tied up at Yen Tung Quan, where a young Baptist missionary named John Birch discovered Doolittle's party. Birch had fled his church after Pearl Harbor when the Japanese rounded up every American they could find. He climbed into the cabin and came face to face with the bearded aviators, who were thrilled to meet someone who spoke the language. Doolittle briefed him on the operation and asked if he would travel with them as interpreter. Birch agreed at once, and the group set off by rail, bus, and rickshaw, navigating through Japanese patrols toward Chuchao. Pharaoh's bomber, the Bat Out of Hell, ran out of fuel over Nanchang, Japanese-held territory. The pilot ordered the crew to bail out. Bombardier Jacob de Chazer landed on a grave in a cemetery, fracturing several ribs, but felt so relieved to be alive that he hugged the dirt mound. He cut up his parachute to make a cover for his head and trudged through muddy rice paddies until he found shelter in a shrine. Navigator George Barr landed in a rice paddy and wandered through a maze of fields, only to have a sentry shove a rifle in his back. He was marched into a room where a dozen Japanese officers sat around a table loaded with wine and cigarettes, delighted with their prize. Bobby Height, the co-pilot, drifted down into a rice paddy and shed his parachute. But Japanese soldiers surrounded him at dawn and drove him to Nanchang in a 1938 Ford truck. De Chazer was tricked by soldiers who claimed to be Chinese, then told he was in the hands of the Imperial Japanese Army in the military police headquarters. Each man was questioned separately. The gunners gave false stories about flying from a mysterious island. Pharaoh gave only his name and rank. When the prisoners refused to talk, the Japanese dragged de Chazer to an interrogation room where a squat judge with a cigar threatened to cut off his head at sunrise. Lawson's crew, after 2 days of brutal travel on bamboo litters and flat-bottomed boats, finally reached NCA Hospital in Linghai. Dr. Chen Shenyan had walked 12 hours through the night to reach them, packing a small surgical kit. He found Lawson with a compound fracture of the left kneecap, deep lacerations covering his face, and 8 teeth knocked out on the right side. The pilot's wounds were hideously infected, and he floated in and out of consciousness. Chen dressed the injuries as best he could with the limited supplies, then ordered the men carried 40 miles over rugged terrain to his hospital, where proper beds with real springs awaited. On the coast, Nielsen woke on the beach where he had collapsed after the Green Hornet crash. He spotted vultures overhead and down the shore, 2 washed-up bodies in orange life vests. He crawled through the bushes and found himself staring at a Japanese rifle. A guerrilla helped him escape to a garrison, where he reunited with pilot Hallmark, whose leg was badly banged up. They buried their dead crewmates, Bombardier Dieter and Gunner Fitzmaurice, on a small knoll with wooden caskets and a prayer. But the Japanese arrived 3 days later, hundreds of soldiers with rifles and bayonets. The Chinese led the Japanese captain to the Airmen. "You now Japanese prisoner," the officer announced. "You no worry, we treat you fine." On April 22nd, guards dragged Chase Nielsen from his cell in Shanghai into a cramped interrogation room. 6 Japanese officers sat around a table, while a civilian interpreter offered him tea. He drank it awkwardly with his hands still in handcuffs, a restraint he had worn without relief for days. The interpreter asked where he came from and what he was doing in China. Nielsen gave only his name, rank, and serial number. The interrogators slapped him across the face at least 30 times until his ears rang. Others kicked his shins hard enough to draw blood. When he still refused to talk, 4 enlisted men seized him, threw him to the floor, and placed a towel over his face. One guard poured water over the towel, funneling it into his mouth and nostrils. Every breath he took sucked water into his lungs, and he began to lose consciousness. Seconds before he blacked out, guards jerked him upright. The interpreter demanded he talk, but Nielsen shook his head no. The Japanese slid a bamboo pole behind his knees and twisted his cuffed arms backward until he dropped to his knees in agony. An officer brought his heel down on Nielsen's kneecaps again and again until his legs went numb. Guards then blindfolded him, marched him outside, and staged a mock execution, complete with rifle bolts clicking into place. They hung him by his handcuffs from a wooden peg on the wall for the rest of the night. In Nanchang that same week, Jacob de Chazer faced a squat Japanese judge who claimed to be the kindest judge in all China. The judge asked how to pronounce the word Hornet, and de Chazer refused to answer. Each time the judge demanded information about the raid, de Chazer replied, "I won't talk." The judge finally slammed his fist on the table, drew his sword, and threatened to cut off de Chazer's head at sunrise. DeShazer looked at the bright steel blade and answered that it would be a great honor to have the kindest judge in all China cut his head off. The courtroom erupted in laughter. Bobby Hite faced a similar interrogation, where an interpreter offered him cigarettes if he would talk. Hite replied that he was a prisoner of war and not required to give any more than his name, rank, and serial number. The interpreter screamed that they would shoot him where he sat, but Hite held firm. George Barr did not hold out. Guards laid the navigator on the floor, shoved rags in his mouth, and poured water over his face. The water ran down his nostrils and into his lungs, stopping his breathing. After 20 minutes of this torture, Barr could not tolerate it any longer. He confessed that the flyers had taken off from an aircraft carrier, giving the Japanese their first confirmed intelligence about the mission. The Japanese now had proof that the bombers had come from the Hornet. On April 25th, the captured raiders were loaded onto a transport plane bound for Tokyo. Handcuffed, blindfolded, and tied with ropes, they sat in silence as the aircraft droned east for hours. DeShazer stole glimpses out the window and spotted the unmistakable cone of Mount Fuji. He knew at that moment where they were going. The plane touched down outside the capital, and guards marched the prisoners into separate cells for further interrogation. Nielsen was flown from Shanghai to Tokyo on the same transport. When guards removed his blindfold, he spotted Hallmark looking equally haggard from their shared ordeal. The two exchanged a thumbs-up sign before guards blindfolded them again and loaded them aboard. Nielsen could see a little through the cloth and noted they seemed to be flying toward the sun. He figured Tokyo was the goal, and it was, far to the north. Ski York and his crew remained interned in Khabarovsk, unaware of their comrades' capture and torture. The Russians kept them in a country house outside the city, fed them black bread and caviar, and served vodka with every meal. Their days blurred into a monotonous routine of sleeping, whittling wood, and listening to news reports that claimed Japan had shot down most of the raiders. With no way to verify the truth, the internees could only wait and hope. Earlier that week, on April 21, President Roosevelt faced the press in Washington. Reporters pressed him for details about the raid on Tokyo. How had American bombers reached the Japanese capital? Where had they come from? Roosevelt leaned forward with a grin. "They came from our new secret base at Shangri-La," he announced. The room erupted in laughter. Only about half the journalists understood the reference to James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon, which described a fictional hidden valley in Tibet. But the line was perfect. It told the world exactly what Roosevelt wanted them to know, that America had struck back, and that the enemy would never know where the next blow would come from. The phrase became an instant symbol of the raid's mystery and the nation's defiant spirit. Roosevelt would later name the new presidential retreat in Maryland after that same fictional paradise. In Tokyo, the mood was anything but cheerful. The Japanese army had publicly claimed that 9 American bombers were shot down over the capital. Not a single raider had been lost to enemy fire. Every bomber loss was due to fuel exhaustion, weather, or crash landings after leaving Japan. Senior military leaders knew the truth, and the shame stung. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto retreated to his stateroom aboard the battleship Yamato, refusing to come out. His chief steward had never seen the admiral so depressed. Rear Admiral Motome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, recorded the humiliation in his diary. The raid had shattered their confidence. The Japanese people had been told their homeland was invulnerable. Now they searched the sky each morning, waiting for the next attack. The raid had one consequence that outweighed all others. Before the attack, the Japanese army had refused to support the Navy's plan to capture Midway Atoll. The generals argued it was a dangerous overextension of Japan's defensive perimeter. The bombs that fell on Tokyo ended that debate. The army now agreed to provide troops for the operation. Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka, who had strongly opposed the Midway plan, later admitted that the Doolittle Raid made the Japanese realize the threat from the east was immediate and pressing. The decision was made, combined fleet would steam for Midway in early June. That battle, fought just weeks after the raid, would become the turning point of the Pacific War. Mitsuo Fuchida, the pilot who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, wrote that Japan had gained its way thanks to the unwitting assistance of Colonel Jimmy Doolittle and his flyers. Doolittle himself returned to Washington a few weeks later, expecting a court-martial for losing all his bombers. Instead, General Henry Arnold informed him that the raid had been a tremendous success. Doolittle received the Congressional Medal of Honor and was promoted to brigadier general. The Navy later named an aircraft carrier the Shangri-La, and Doolittle was invited to christen her. Admiral Halsey, who commanded the task force that launched the raid, went on to become a fleet admiral and a key architect of Allied victory in the Pacific. Of the 80 raiders, 3 died during the escape from China, and 8 were captured. 3 of those, including Dean Hallmark, were executed, 1 died of disease, and the remaining 4 Chase Nielsen, Jacob DeShazer, Bobby Height, and George Barr survived the war. Navigator Hank Potter survived the jump and returned to active service. Charles McClure, despite his broken arms, recovered and survived the war. David Thatcher was awarded the Silver Star for his heroism and survived the war. DeShazer later returned to Japan as a Christian missionary. John Birch, the missionary who guided Doolittle, continued his work in China and was later killed by Chinese communists, becoming a controversial figure in Cold War history. Ted Lawson, his leg saved by Dr. Chen at the NC Hospital, was evacuated to the United States where he underwent months of surgery. Ski York and his crew remained interned in Russia for more than a year before they escaped through Iran. The raid had cost America all its bombers, but it had proved one thing: Japan was not untouchable. If you have any family stories from the early months of the Pacific War, or memories passed down from relatives who served in the years that followed, we would be honored to hear them in the comments below. We read everyone. Thank you for listening to this account of the Doolittle Raid. If you appreciate these deep dives into history, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support makes it possible for us to continue telling these stories. Thank you.